Go ahead and start. Great. Well, welcome everybody today. We are excited to have Chris and Calvin from the University of Cambridge present their 2021 NERBS paper, Natural Continual Learning, Success as a Journey, Not Just a Destination. Chris is actually still a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, but Calvin is a postdoc at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit. We are very excited to hear your talk today, so I guess without further ado, please take it away.
Thanks, James. Well, to introduce, I'm Calvin, and I'm here today with Chris. I think Vito is also on the call, and who's a collaborator on this project. We also work with Alberto, who's now a researcher at Media Tech Research, and Guillaume is our PhD advisor at Cambridge. So I think just quickly go through what we're going to talk about. I think that this audience, we probably don't need to motivate to continual learning too much, but nevertheless, I'll quickly go through how we think about it. We'll talk about some common approaches to continual learning, and then we'll illustrate the idea of natural continual learning, or NCL, which is our method, using a very example to the basic idea across. I'll give a quick derivation of the method, and then relate it to projected gradient methods like OWN. I'll also talk briefly about some feedforward network results relating to split MNIST and also subpar. And then I'll hand it over to Chris to talk about results relating to RNNs, some analysis of the dynamics of these RNNs that we train using natural continual learning, and also discuss how this might relate to biological learning. Great. So this is actually comes from Chris, but here I'm showing you a video of Federer surfing in 2009 on the left, and in 2017 on the right. And you can see, maybe not very clearly now, but the movements are remarkably similar over time, and it's a general principle for humans and for animals. We are able to maintain these kind of stable skills over long periods of time, despite most likely having learned many different skills in between. And it's a general problem. We're interested in how intelligence, or human intelligence in particular, is able to do this, and how we might apply this to train artificial agents to also have this kind of ability. So the general setup of continual learning, at least insofar as machine learning is concerned, we typically have, let's say, K tasks that we learn one by one sequentially, and we hope that even though we do this sequentially, we won't lose out on performance as we acquire new tasks. So let's say you learn to play tennis, you go on to play football, you learn to play hockey, and then when you come back to play tennis, it would be very surprising if somehow you've forgotten entirely how to play tennis. But this seems to be what happens in essentially artificial agents that we train today if we don't apply continual learning methods to it and just train them.
Hey, Calvin, can I stop you for a second? I don't know if something's different, but it's very hard to hear you right now. So if there's any way to move closer or something, that would be helpful. Sorry about that.
Better, or is this still not good?
I can hear you better now. Thank you.
Okay, I think I just need to probably speak into the mic a bit more. Please do shout if it's going off again. Okay, so given the model f of theta, where theta are the parameters, so we're really mostly considering a supervised learning kind of setting, where we have some input data and we're trying to learn a model that models the input-output distribution. So let's say we have K task, and what we want to learn is essentially a parameter set that's going to work well on all the K tasks that we have in our task set. But we only get to learn from LK, so each of these tasks sequentially over time, without, at least in the setting that we consider, without really being able to go back and reconsider previous tasks. Okay, so what are some common approaches to continual learning? sure most of you are probably pretty familiar with this already. One of, I think, the simplest but very powerful idea is to do replay, or generative replay. And the idea is to save a couple of data samples from previous tasks to approximate the loss function from the last, let's say, k-1 tasks. And as we learned task k, we kind of weigh the current loss function and our approximate loss function for the last k-1 task jointly. For example, we might learn a generative distribution of the last k-1 task using past data samples, and then just sample these previous tasks using that generator, and then we train on this loss, this joint loss together on task k, so that we don't forget on previous tasks. So there are many different flavors of this, and I think the general idea is to save some kind of information on past tasks and use it in the present. For example, you might save, for example, gradient information and use that to constrain how you update your parameters on the current task, and so on. Another big kind of class of methods that people have been looking at are these Bayesian weight regularization methods. Probably the most notable one in recent years will be the one by Kirkpatrick, the EWC method, but obviously this goes back a long way to Bayesian online learning ideas. And so here we represent the loss function of each task as a likelihood, so the log probability of the data set on the current task given our parameters data. And what we would like to do whenever we see a new task k is to maintain some kind of posterior over our parameters theta of the, given the last 1 to k-1 task. So it's the second term here that I'm highlighting on the last line here, and combine that with the likelihood of the current task k. And this will be the objective that we try to optimize. This would essentially be doing map learning, right? If we're just optimizing for the theta as a if you just kind of want a point estimate and optimize theta directly, or you might try and maintain a full distribution of thetas by doing some kind of approximate Bayesian learning, because this posterior is typically intractable. So you might approximate your posterior over theta given the last k-1 task using a Gaussian, for example. And if you do this, then the second term in this objective function at the bottom is going to be some kind of quadratic term involving theta, which is penalizing essentially deviations of your current parameters given the last best parameter, theta star, with this kind of quadratic objective, which is why sometimes we also call Bayesian weight regularization. The last class of method that I think is another big class of methods that people have been looking at are projected gradient methods. So the idea here is we're going to try and update our parameters predominantly along directions that are not important for the last k-1 tasks, so that we do not interfere with previous tasks. And this can be done in a variety of ways, but usually you try and identify some kind of so-called important directions for previous tasks. For example, if you might obtain the Hessian, try and estimate some kind of Hessian of the previous objective to kind of get a sense of what the curvature looks like around your last optimum, and try and update your parameters based on this. So the idea will be you'll be updating much faster along directions that do not matter for previous tasks relative to current tasks. Relative to directions that do matter for the current task that you're optimizing. Just to check, is the volume okay now?
Yeah, the volume is much better. Thank you very much. Sometimes there's a little bit of trail off, but like we can understand everything. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. So our approach that we kind of introduced today is really kind of a combination of the last two classes of methods. We try and combine these two and show that a lot of the projected gradient descent methods can really be seen as doing some kind of Bayesian weight regularization, but where the projection matrix that we're using now is some kind of approximate Hessian of the posterior given the last k minus 1. This is what we do. And although our method doesn't really incorporate any replay, I think it is not in any way in conflict with replay-based method. In fact, I think a very fruitful and interesting direction going forward would be to see how we might be able to combine them together, as people have done, combining, for example, OWM and Generative replay type methods. Okay, so now I'm going to give use a very simple toy example to illustrate why we think we need to combine kind of the features of both Bayesian weight regularization and projective gradient. So let me try and walk through this a bit slowly because it's complicated. So right now we just have two tasks. Okay, we have L1 and L2 as shown here, and they're both just quadratic functions. So task 1 has an optimal point theta 1 star. Task 2 has an optimal point theta 2 star. And they have their own Q matrices. And so here on the right in the figures, I'm showing you here on the leftmost plot, it's essentially the loss landscape for loss 1, as well as the optimum for loss 1, which is the red star, for loss 2, which is the blue star, as well as the combined objective, which is the true objective that we really want to optimize as we go along this, which is the purple star. In the second figure in the middle, I'm showing you the loss landscape for the blue, for the second task, and the third figure on the right, I'm showing you the combined objective. So this is the true objective that we actually want to optimize, even though we only get to see L1 and L2 simulation. So kind of as a just before I show you what actually happens when we apply each of these methods, I'll give a brief kind of summary about what you're about to see. So what the Laplace method is going to do is it's essentially, so firstly we assume that we've solved task 1. So we start at the red star, right? And now our objective is to try and optimize for task 2. So what the Laplace objective is going to try and do is to optimize for task 2, but also regularize it towards something that is good for task 1, right? So what you'll see is it kind of moves towards the blue star, but eventually converges due to the regularization term to the global objective, the purple. What about for the projective gradient method? So this is a term where we're going to only really update our task, our loss on task 2 along that directions that don't really matter for task 1. So in the red figure, you can see the directions that don't really matter essentially directly points towards the global optimum. Right? It's very shallow along these directions, the slanted direction. So what it's going to do is essentially go straight down. But because it's not regularized, it's going to move towards the blue star. And our method is a kind of a merging of the best of two worlds. You see it's going to go directly towards the global optimum. So this is the Laplace method. It kind of goes quickly towards the blue star, and then it converges to the purple star. The projected method goes towards the purple star, to the global optimum, but because it doesn't have the right fixed point, it eventually goes back to the to task 2's optimum as opposed to the global optimum. And what the black line does, which is our method, it's a combination of both. So it doesn't at all move towards the task 2 at all. It just kind of goes straight towards. And so what this is basically showing is that the fixed point of the objective does matter. Okay? So the Laplace method works well, right? Because it has sort of the right fixed point and has the global optimum as the fixed point. Obviously, this is a very contrived example where all the losses are convex. But the projected gradient method, even though it seems to do really well in the beginning, kind of veers off towards the end. So now we're going to go and show why the Laplace-based kind of method, so the Bayesian weight regularization-based method might not work so well. So what we've done is essentially in our second task, we're going to add this additional objective, C theta, which I won't go into detail of what it is. You can find it in the paper, but it's essentially a Gaussian bump that adds some kind of non-convexity. So if you focus on the middle blue plot at the bottom, you see that essentially the objective is large. And if you look at what the global optimum is now, it is still the purple star. Right? But then we've introduced essentially a local minimum here, right between red. Okay. So this is a somewhat contrived example, but what we're trying to illustrate is what could go wrong in the Laplacian, the Bayesian weight regularization. And that is because we are essentially optimizing towards blue star while regularizing towards the purple star, you can get stuck in these kind of local minima. The projected gradient method completely avoids this, right? But then even when it gets to the global optimum, because it still doesn't have the right fixed point, it's going to veer off back to the blue star. Whereas our method, because we have both the right fixed point, and we kind of look at directions that don't matter on previous tasks, we can kind of avoid these local minima. So what this is really trying to illustrate is that fixed points of these objectives do matter, but so does the path of the optimization. Okay, so this is kind of the basic idea. And I think our implementation, or sorry, our algorithm is really just a specific instantiation of these basic ideas. And I think there's actually, in the space of algorithms, there's probably a lot of other algorithms that could probably do this and maybe do it even better. But the basic idea is that fixed points probably do matter, the objective that you actually optimize does matter, but also the path that you take towards those points also matters. Okay, so natural continuum. So, as you said, kind of our starting point of derivation is really just Bayesian weight regularization. So we're trying to compute the posterior of theta given the last k-1 task as well as the given. So we can write this as being proportional to our likelihood term, which is the k given theta, as well as our posterior given the last k-1 task. Because the posterior is, especially for a neural network, is going to be intractable. So do as most people do. We essentially approximate it with a Gaussian. And so your mu of k-1 is going to be the mean of our posterior, and lambda is going to be the precision. And so we can, if we make this approximation, the posterior that we are looking at is essentially going to have this form. We're going to have the likelihood term, and then this quadratic penalty that I've been talking about, where you're regularizing your parameters towards the last one. And you have a fairly simple update rule if you do kind of EWC type thing, where you first try and get a map estimate of mu k-1, and around that you consider what the Hessian is, which is hk, and then to get the new kind of position, you simply add it to your position for the last k-1. So this is, sorry, and I should probably also say, in most of the methods that we consider, the Hessian is a somewhat complicated object to deal with. It isn't necessarily positive semi-definite, which could be an issue, and so people typically approximate it using the Fisher methods. So the EWC method essentially has a diagonal approximation to the Fisher, and so this is just the online approximation. And so our method is really just a very simple extension of this, where we now optimize this objective log p of theta given the last k-1 task. So as we're kind of doing this map update, instead of doing something like Atom or using some kind of typical optimizer, we're going to do a trust region optimization, where we make a linear approximation to our loss at the current point, the current estimate of theta, and then we're going to try and minimize this objective for some search direction delta, so long as delta is going to be of a certain length, of a fixed length in which we trust this quadratic approximation, where this distance is now going to be measured according to the precision matrix of our posterior in the last class. Right. So as I mentioned, this lambda k minus 1 is essentially a curvature object that tells us which are the directions that do matter or don't matter in the last k minus 1 classes. Right. And so what this is effectively going to do is going to give you an update rule that looks very similar to a natural gradient type update, where we're now preconditioning our gradient on the current pass with the position of the posterior. Sorry, the covariance of the position, covariance of the posterior on the last k minus 1 pass. Right? And so what this is going to do is essentially going to take really large steps along directions that don't matter for the last k minus 1 pass, but take very short steps in directions that are very steep, essentially, that really matter for the last k minus 1 pass. And so this is on it. This is just a very short derivation. The algorithm itself is actually kind of easy. Okay, so how does this relate to some of the other projected gradient descent methods that we've seen in the past? So what we do in the paper is that even this covariance matrix or the position matrix of this posterior is usually intractable because it's such a big object. Right, so for a neural network of 1 million parameters, to actually compute this, it's going to be millions. And so what we do, for example, the EWC method does is it makes a diagonal approximation. And what we did was we instead make a conic factor approximation, which is a slightly better approximation to this vision matrix, where we essentially have a block diagonal.
Calvin, you're trailing off a little bit occasionally right now, so it'd be good just to make sure to stay close to the microphone and kind of speak loud and clearly. Thank you.
Well, I'm almost done, so you guys will be done with me soon. And so if you kind of write it out, if you make this chronic refactored approximation to this position matrix, and sorry, I should have probably also said, now let's just consider the parameters in a single layer. So the weight matrix, for example, of a single layer, and we're now trying to optimize this. So the update rule that we're actually going to end up with, because we have a Kronecker approximation to the precision matrix, we're going to get something that looks like the gradient of the weight matrix being of the loss with respect to weight matrix being sandwiched between these left and right projection. And what we found is that, and actually, kind of comparing our method to some of the other methods that exist in the literature, you can actually see that there's actually a remarkable amount of similarities between some of these methods. For example, OWN will have an L matrix where it is just an identity, and the right preconditioner is just the covariance of your activity at every layer. Oh, sorry, I should have probably said this is I should have L inverse and R inverse. Sorry, this is and then the difference for us is we have the covariance of the activity as R, but we have the back propagated gradients at each layer. G and G transpose. And compared to the method that we call double orthogonal weight modification, DOWN, which is this method proposed by Leah Dunker, Laura Driscoll, and NURBS paper in 2020, where essentially the left projection matrix is essentially what we would call, because they applied their methods to recurrent networks, and this is essentially what we're looking for is the covariance of the recurrent inputs at each layer. And these methods, the OWM and DOWM, are kind of motivated purely from the idea of projecting your parameters along directions that are orthogonal to activities that you have seen in the past in your layer. Right? So the covariance of activities you've seen in the past, or the recurrent inputs that you have seen in the past. Whereas we draw this connection to show that if you kind of do Bayesian, make a Bayesian, you take your Bayesian method and then you do some kind of approximations to it, you actually end up with something that looks remarkably similar. And obviously, one of the big differences between our method and OWM and DOWM is we also have this additional regularization term, which I've shown in, at least in the toy example that could matter. Okay, so I'm going to quickly talk about some results for feedforward networks, and then I'll hand it over to Chris. So we essentially apply our method to both MNIST and CIFAR, as is typically done in the literature. We compared with a bunch of different methods, like synaptic intelligence, EWC. K-fact here is essentially the EWC, but making a Kronecker factor approximation to the Fisher matrix compared to OWM. And here we have both NCL no opt and NCL. I'm talking about it later. But essentially, NCL no opt means we don't optimize this hyperparameter, which tunes how much we weigh the prior, which is something that have been shown in the past to be incredibly important for methods like EWC. This is just to show that these methods. We consider, as Guido presented in his previous work, in 3 different settings. There's task incremental learning, domain incremental learning, class incremental learning. We also do favorably in domain incremental. We actually don't do quite as well as OWM in the class incremental setting. And we reckon this is probably because in this setting, the actual Fisher approximation that we get in these tasks is relatively poor. But this is something that we're also interested in. All right, so that's it for me. Any questions at this point before I hand it over to Chris? Okay, if not, I'll just over to Chris.
Cool. Should I just, if you want to stop sharing, Calvin, I'll just see if this works. Can you guys see my screen? Yes. Well, that's a pleasant surprise. Cool. Okay, and you can all hear me?
Perfect. You're great.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, so for kind of the second bit of the presentation, I'll be talking a little bit about some results, some analyses that we've been looking at in recurrent neural networks. And we think these are quite interesting because recurrent neural networks is kind of a more challenging setting for continual learning methods, because in these large feedforward neural networks we have quite a lot of parameters, and even if you just distributed these parameters across the different tasks you're learning, you could actually do quite well. Whereas in recurrent neural networks, because you kind of have, it's essentially having parameter sharing in each layer, then you have less kind of freedom in parameter space. And so, whereas in these feedforward networks, you can often get away with being quite strict in the regularization, because the main problem is interference with previous tasks. In recurrent neural networks, you have to be quite careful not to be too aggressive in your regularization, because you might essentially run out of capacity in parameter space to learn new tasks. So this is kind of one reason we find this an interesting setting. And the other reason is that we're also interested in this from kind of a neuroscience point of view, in trying to understand how the brain does continual learning. And the brain, you know, as we've seen from much work in the past decade, can often be kind of well described as kind of a recurrent neural network. And so in this case, we have, you know, as Calvin talked about, right, we have like a set of data sets, right, or well, we have for each task, we have a data set, dk, which consists of some input x and some output y. And we now have this additional index, which is time, because it's kind of a sequence evolving in time. We have some network dynamics, which are just kind of standard vanilla RNN dynamics. And we have some output distribution, which would be Gaussian or categorical, depending on the task. We're going to look at two tasks that I'm just going to briefly introduce. The details won't matter too much, so if it's not super clear, that's not a major issue, but it's just to give some intuition of what we're looking at. So the first task is this set of kind of stimulus response tasks, which are inspired by tasks in neuroscience known as pro-tasks and anti-tasks. And they were developed by Robert Yang et al. In 2019 and was first used for continual learning by Leah Donker and Laura Driscoll in a paper that Calvin's also mentioned previously. And the idea is basically that you have an RNN, right, and initially gets some stimulus, which is essentially an angle, and then there is this input is given to the network at different points in time during the stimulus period, and then during the response period, the network has to respond with a certain function of the stimulus, right? And so this could be a pro task if it has to respond with the same angle, right? So it gets its input data and it has to respond theta, or it could be an anti-task if it has to respond kind of the opposite way. So it gets its input theta and it has to respond theta plus pi. So this kind of gives you two dimensions along which to modify the task. And you can imagine more dimensions along which you can modify this task, such as introducing a delay or not introducing a delay. And so in this way, you can kind of construct a dictionary of tasks, right? And this gives you a regime in which to do continual learning by essentially considering these different tasks and making sure that by learning the new tasks, you don't forget the previous tasks, right? And so you can imagine there's some shared structure, which is how do you represent an angle, but there's also some structure that's different, which is things like, do I want to respond theta or do I want to respond theta plus pi? So this is kind of the first task set that we consider. And then the second task set we consider is one proposed by De Jong et al., actually not for continual learning, but it's called stroke MNIST, which is like a continuous time version of MNIST. So instead of getting kind of the full pixel space of an image, you get at each point in time, you get the direction of a pen stroke, right? So if this was your input, this number 2, right, you get at time t is equal to 1, you'd get, moved right, then you get moved diagonal upwards, move right, move diagonal upwards. And this is your input as a sequence over time. And the task now is, having been given this input to the RNN, it has to respond with a corresponding digit and be able to tell different digits apart. So these are kind of the two tasks that we consider. And the first thing I'll talk about is this pro-anti task set. And we're going to use this as kind of a test bed for some of these ideas that Calvin talked about in the toy example, namely the importance of fixed points versus optimization paths, because this is kind of a nice kind of test bed for investigating these questions. So this is just kind of the performance of our method. And the way to interpret this plot is that each line corresponds to a different task. So we basically have 6 different task versions of this stimulus response task. So and then kind of the shading indicates which task you're being trained on, right? So initially you're being trained on kind of blue task and you learn blue task, right? And then you start being trained on orange task and you learn orange task, but importantly you don't forget blue task. Then you get trained on green task, but importantly you don't forget orange and blue task, right? So this is the idea, and at the end you've kind of learned all the tasks, but even having learned all these ones, you still haven't really forgotten blue task, right? So let's compare to a different method, which is this KFAC method that Calvin talked about, which is elastic weight consolidation with a Kronecker factored Fisher matrix. So an important thing to note here is that this method actually is optimizing the exact same objective as our method, right? Like if you look at the fixed points, they will be exactly the same. The difference is in the optimization path, that we do this preconditioning or this gradient projection, right? And we see that even though the objective is the same, actually the performance for this KFAC method is quite bad. And in a sense, it's not surprising, right? Because you can also say, these projected gradient descent methods, the previous projected gradient descent methods, have the same objective function as doing no continual learning at all, but clearly perform better. But it's still kind of interesting to see that kind of this objective itself isn't sufficient to improve performance. And so anyone who's looked at these methods will know that this is unsurprising if you haven't done hyperparameter optimization for something like EWC. And oh, did this just go black for everyone? One sec. Cool. Okay. If you want things to work well, then what you need to do is you need to introduce this parameter lambda in EWC, which kind of in a Bayesian setting, what it's doing is it's essentially overcounting the prior, right? So you're saying I have my likelihood term, which is my loss on the current task, and then I have my regularization term, which is like a prior term, and I'm going to scale this by lambda. And lambda, for this to be like proper Bayesian, lambda has to be 1, but in practice, lambda often has to be 100, 1,000, a million, right? So you really have to modify this loss function. And I think the way people usually think about this is that this Laplace approximation is bad, right? And so we need to regularize more. And this is important because it essentially restructures our loss landscape. But an interesting thing to note is that this doesn't just affect our loss landscape, but if you're doing something, so we do some kind of prior, but now if you think about what's the Hessian of this loss now, right? Then you'll find that as lambda goes to infinity, then this term becomes negligible, and your Hessian essentially becomes proportional to this prior precision matrix. And this is interesting to note because this is exactly the gradient projector that we use in natural continual learning, right? Like this is what we project with, and this is the main difference between kind of what we do and KFAC. And this is further interesting because often when we train these networks, we use something like ADAM or RMS prop, which is essentially a cheap approximation to natural gradient descent, right? So it's actually preconditioning with a diagonal approximation to the precision matrix. And so if you think about it, as you increase lambda, your precision to the Fisher matrix, as you increase lambda, your Fisher matrix increasingly looks like the precision matrix of the posterior, which is what we claim is a good projection matrix. And we can actually quantify this by thinking, as a function of lambda, if you run ADAM on this objective, right, like the EWC objective, what's the difference between the preconditioner used by ADAM and the preconditioner used by NCL? And it turns out that as you increase lambda, actually what you do by doing ADAM with EWC increasingly looks like NCL. You're essentially doing the same type of preconditioning. And so what we're saying is that maybe this doesn't work solely by modifying the loss landscape. Maybe part of the reason lambda is important is actually because you're making a precondition of the right thing. And so an interesting question to ask is, what if we increase lambda, right? But we only increase lambda for the covariance estimate in ADAM. We don't actually increase it for the loss. So it's trying to kind of separate these two separate things, right? Like we're increasing lambda and doing ADAM, we're doing two things. We're modifying the loss landscape and we're modifying the preconditioner, right? But what if we only modify the preconditioner as we would in EWC, right? So we're not kind of doing the full NCL thing, but we're doing something in between EWC and NCL. And we see in this case, I forgot my axis labels or my labels here, but basically as you go along here, you're increasing the value of lambda, and the black line here is increasing the average performance kind of at the end of learning, right? But this is increasing lambda only for the preconditioner in ADAM, not for the loss. And we see that actually changing the preconditioner is sufficient to improve performance without changing the loss at all. So I think it's an interesting thing to think about, like, why do the things that we do work, and how does this balance these two ideas that Calvin talked about previously? Cool. And so now I've kind of used this as kind of a test bed for some of these ideas, but like what actually happens when we optimize lambda and compare to these methods the way people usually would by optimizing hyperparameters. And we see that in this case in the recurrent neural networks, in a similar way to what we saw in the feedforward networks, NCL performs quite well. So here we're plotting the loss, so lower is better, right? And we see that in this stimulus response task, NCL performs well, and it performs actually better than all these reference methods, DOWM, OWM, and also better than KFAC once you've optimized lambda. And in this stroke MNIST task, you see kind of the same effect. So it's not just the case that this performs well in these kind of toy examples and toy settings. It actually does seem to do well in practice. Okay, so this is kind of the performance section, and that relied mostly on the stimulus response task. Now we're going to move on to this stroke MNIST task, and we're trying to understand kind of what's actually going on in the dynamics of this network, right? How do the dynamics of the network allow us to learn multiple tasks sequentially without forgetting? And the way we're going to do this is we're basically going to learn, right, all the tasks sequentially, and after each task, we're going to say, what do the so this is like this stroke MNIST task is like a pair. It's like split MNIST. So you're basically doing a pairwise classification task. And so we're going to just consider a single classification task, which is trying to tell apart whether you were shown a 4 or you were shown a 5, right? So that's kind of what we show here. Then we're going to look at the dynamics of the network in response to the inputs that you get for this task. But we're going to look at these dynamics at different points over the course of training. So first we look at the dynamics after we've only learned one task. And this task, importantly, isn't the task which is classifying 4 versus 5s. The color here indicates whether the input was a 4 or a 5, right? And so we see that there's no separation of these two categories, which suggests that the network hasn't learned the task, right? So that's k equals 1. We've learned one task. Then we learn the second task. This second task is the task of distinguishing 4 and 5, right? So once we've learned to distinguish 4 and 5s, if we query the network dynamics, then we'll see that the network learns to separate 4s in purple and 5s in green, right? So we've learned to solve the task, which we know from our kind of previous performance plots. But what's now interesting to see is, so this is obviously dynamics in kind of a two-dimensional space, just so we can visualize it. But what's interesting to ask is, are these dynamics in response to 4 versus 5, do they change when we learn new tasks, or have we actually preserved this kind of dynamical subspace of the network as we proceed to learn new tasks? So what happens as we learn, task 3, task 4, 5, 6, task 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on and so forth. And so our squared value is basically just kind of the correlation of these trajectories, or the R squared of these trajectories. And so we see that what's actually going on in the network is that once we've learned the task, then we preserve the input-output mapping that we have. And we preserve not just the input-output mapping that we had previously. We actually preserve the dynamics associated with a given input. So you can convince yourself that these plots all look fairly similar. And so what's happening when we learn the kind of a new task is that we're using a different kind of dynamical subspace, right? So if we learn task 1 versus 7, which we learned here, then initially these aren't separable. And then when we learn the task, they become separable. And once they are separable, then we've stabilized this kind of dynamical subspace. So we essentially learn the different tasks in kind of orthogonal subspaces of these network dynamics. And you might say, oh, well, this is not surprising because, we learned the task. So clearly, we had to preserve what's going on. But this is actually not true. You could imagine a scenario where you still preserve kind of the input-output mapping, but you haven't preserved the dynamics. And interestingly, if you did kind of learning with replay on this task, then this is exactly what you would see, that initially you learn to separate kind of green and orange when you learn this task. But if you kind of project it into the same two-dimensional subspace, as you learn more and more tasks, then these categories are actually not separate in this subspace anymore. The kind of subspace that separates these two inputs have been rotated in some non-trivial way, right? And so this gives you a very different picture from what we saw before. You're still performing well. You're actually performing better in this case, because the way we implemented learning with replay is essentially training on the joint loss, right? But the dynamic solution is very different. And I'm not going to talk too much about why, because we're running a little bit over time. But what I am going to do is I'm going to just have a quick think about, how does this relate to what's actually going on in the brain? So here I stole some recordings from circuits in real neurons from kind of two fairly recent papers, Jensen et al. And Driscoll et al. And kind of the first set of recordings is from some motor circuits. So this is the dorsolateral striatum, and this is the motor cortex. And this is just some example neurons where essentially we recorded the activity of this neuron on kind of day 1. So the x-axis here is kind of time within some trial that the animals have been asked to do, and the y-axis is kind of which day have you gone through. And so we see that these neurons essentially do the same thing on day 1 as they do on day 2, and day 3, and day 4, and day 5, right? And all the neurons kind of have a stable activity profile, or like a stable representation of this task. And again, even though these circuits are involved in solving the task, you don't necessarily have to maintain a stable kind of dynamical solution to it in the same way that this wasn't necessarily the case for kind of the recurrent neural network. And this here is just kind of showing a histogram on 3 different example states to illustrate that they look similar. But actually, this is not the only thing that's been reported in the neuroscience literature. So Driscoll et al. In this paper report that actually the activity of neurons change over time. So this is, again, kind of an example neuron for 2 different classes of trials. It's a bit harder to see what's going on in this raster. But if you look over here on the mean activity, that's like these histograms here for the blue line is the left trials and the red line is the right trials. I'm not going to go into the details, but the important thing is that they actually see a change in the representation over time. And so I think that's a debate in the neuroscience literature about how much of these differences are real, how much they depend on external factors. But I think it's interesting to think about whether the types of of activity patterns and kind of dynamical solutions that we see in the brain can actually give us hints about the types of algorithms, continual learning algorithms that might be implemented, and trying to understand how the continual learning algorithms that we care about in machine learning, what would be the consequences in terms of the dynamics we would observe in the corresponding kind of neural circuits. And I think continual learning in these recurrent neural networks is a good test bed for trying to begin to address these questions. And with that, I'm going to just kind of slightly summarize what we've been talking about. Initially, we talked a little bit about this importance of optimization paths, as well as the objective function in continual learning, both using kind of toy problems and more slightly less toy problems. And we've shown that NCL kind of combines weight regularization, which changes the loss function, with gradient projection, which changes the optimization path. And it does this by this trust region optimization that Calvin talked about, and this leads to empirically good performance. We showed this and recurrent neural networks, focusing mostly on recurrent neural networks, which we think are interesting because maybe they can also begin to tell us a little bit about kind of what are the consequences of these different types of algorithms at the level of dynamics, and how does this compare to what we saw in biological systems, which I think is something that we often use as motivation in continual learning, both because maybe they can help us understand how can we build better continual learning methods, but also vice versa, how can continual learning help us understand what's going on in these neural circuits. And I think that's it for us. This leaves still a little bit of time if people have questions.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, both of you. And yeah, so I guess the floor is up for questions now. If you are watching on YouTube, you can just put them in the YouTube chat, and I'll ask them here. Or if you're on Microsoft Teams, you can just unmute and ask the question you have right now.
May I ask a question?
Please do.
I just wonder, like, what motivates you to combine the weight regularization and the gradient projection? So what gave you the hint to do that? Some kind of like that.
Calvin, I'll let you answer this one since you were the one who actually had the idea.
Okay, so this actually came about from a sort of roundabout way. So it actually, I have to give credit to
Sorry, I can't.
Just make sure to speak into the microphone, yeah.
Sorry. As I say, this actually came about from a fairly roundabout way. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. So it actually came from reading Leah Dunfer and Laura Driscoll's paper, so this RNN paper that we talked about. And I was looking at, so they have this projection-based methods, and I realized essentially the right projection matrix that they have was essentially the inverse variance matrix of the activity. And I've been looking at natural gradient descent for some time in kind of deep neural networks, and I kind of made the connection that actually when you make a k-factor approximation, this is exactly what you see on the right. And so I sort of got this idea that perhaps you can actually think of why these methods do well, these projective methods do well, as actually approximating this kind of natural learning natural gradient descent, and then we kind of work backwards. So it came about from a roundabout way, and then we eventually arrived at the idea that you can actually derive it from the other way around, which I think is all really cool. Like we didn't know about the OWM method to begin with. To see that resources.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Any more questions? I have one I want to ask. You mentioned early in the presentation that this approach is orthogonal to replay, which obviously I agree with. And I was wondering if you've looked into how, I guess, in the feedforward network approach, how this would scale to larger data sets and problems. Specifically, maybe if you were able to incorporate replay, could you beat some of the more state-of-the-art methods on like ImageNet, or is that something that you're not really interested in? You're interested in more of the fundamentals at the low level, and you'll let somebody else grab that later.
Chris, do you want to take that?
Sure. We've definitely been thinking about it. I think kind of personally, Calvin and I are maybe more interested in kind of the equations and kind of the math and the intuition, and I at least also care a lot about kind of thinking about what this can tell us about the brain. It turns out reviewers care a lot about CBAR and big data sets.
Yeah.
So
I'm glad you got a good area chair who was able to make sure that all the fundamental things that you contributed, which were great, far outweighed a experiment on CFAR 100 with Carl. Yeah.
We've definitely been thinking about it, and like we think it is something that would be interesting, and it definitely would provide further insights. In terms of scalability, there's no reason that this wouldn't scale. It's no more expensive than kind of something like EWC, right, or chronic factored EWC, which definitely has been applied to these settings. And I guess kind of maybe the recent literature and a lot of work by Guido, for example, has shown that when we really move to these very challenging data sets, then replay becomes increasingly important, and maybe these like local approximations that we've been making in EWC and related methods are just no longer going to cut it in this more complicated loss landscape. And so I think it would be interesting to see how kind of our method deteriorates with this increasing problem complexity, and whether it does so more gracefully than for example EWC, which we would hope it would, and like we would think it would, because it includes this kind of optimization path regularization. But my guess would be that you're still gonna kind of underperform replay-based methods if you were to scale it up that far, and it would be interesting to see how they interact in practice.
Great. Any more questions? Okay. If not, I guess we can wrap it up there since we're just about out of time. But wanted to thank both of you, Chris and Calvin, for sharing today. It was a wonderful presentation, and I actually have some more questions for you after we stop recording if you want to stay on. And thank you, everybody, for joining today or watching this at a later time. You can catch us again next week. We will be hearing from Hongjoon An on the work separated softmax for incremental learning. Please note, and we'll put this in the announcements, that it will actually be at an earlier time because they will be presenting from South Korea and did not want to present for some reason at 3 a.m. local time. What do you know? So I guess we'll end it there, but thank you so much, everybody, for coming out.
Thank you all for coming.